This is part 4, Archetype of the Spellcaster. If you're enjoying this series and you enjoy these videos, please subscribe, hit the like button, and feel free to leave a comment as well. It's always nice to see your comments, questions, and anything you'd like to add to the dialogue here. So before we start with part 4, I do want to backtrack a little bit into part 3, because in this slide there is something that I explained that I realized that I left something out. So I just wanted to cover this briefly before we get back into part 4. So in the third paragraph here, I'm going to read this. It says, in the Judeo-Persian tradition, everyone could learn how to read, not just the upper class. The most intelligent became holy men. They were allowed to marry, thus choosing intelligent women, presumably, right, and having intelligent children with, presumably. There's a general likelihood that that would happen, right? The most intelligent among the Christian priesthood were unwittingly made extinct from the greedy doctrine of celibacy. So what I didn't explain in part 3 is that if the highest virtue in the Eastern religions and the Persian religions and the Judeo-Persian tradition, if the highest virtue is knowledge and wisdom, right, then it would make sense to allow the rabbis, for example, the magi, to marry, have children, etc., right? But in Rome, in the Vatican, at some point they decided that their clergy were not to marry, were not to have children. And this was, to my understanding, this was financially motivated. And as we discussed a little bit earlier, in previous sections, the conquest and control being being much more of a priority, right, over Christianity's not its highest virtue isn't knowledge and wisdom, obviously, right? So keeping that in mind, a religion of conquest and control is going to want to extract wealth from everywhere it can, wealth and power, right? So in their short-sightedness, they decide the Vatican at some point decided that instead of allowing their priests to have children, to marry and to have children, have families, because what that meant was if a Catholic priest could have a family, then he could leave his estate that would be inherited by his children, by his widow, right? There are quite a few brilliant, very intelligent, educated priests that came through the Catholic Church, for example. And unfortunately, due to the Church's decision, their policy on marriage, they missed out on all of these brilliant priests making more smart people. Yeah, presumably, right? So that's something that isn't talked about very often, but the short-sightedness of the Catholic Church, their greed, essentially, it cost the church in the long run, right? So that's something that isn't often talked about, but it's something that is worth looking at, right? So that's something I should have included in part 3. So let's fast forward to part 4. And this is, of course, Archetype of the Spellcaster. So what we're seeing here is the Stela of Hammurabi. This is a 7-foot tall carving out of diorite, which is similar to graphite. It's a very durable, very hard stone, naturally occurring, and this stela has been dated to approximately 1750 BC, and it's the best known inscription of its kind. I think this is at the Louvre, and I think I've seen this before, but I didn't really know what I was looking at the time. But I do believe this was at the Louvre. This stela uses cuneiform, which is the system of writing. The cuneiform means wedge-shaped, and you'll see here in the next slide or two a close-up of this writing style, and it very much looks like vertical and horizontal wedges. This stela was meant to to convey the law in a public place. So at 7 feet tall, you couldn't miss this thing, right? And there must have been dozens of them around the empire, I would presume. The engraving on the top depicts the sun god Utu, or Shamash, as he was later known, seated on the right, giving to King Hammurabi the laws and the authority to rule. If you look what's in Utu's hand, it reminds me of the ring that is also held in the hand of the figure in the Fravashi, in the Zoroastrian Fravashi that we looked at in the previous parts of this series. There may be some influence there, maybe not, but that struck me as very similar. And you can notice that the sun god is seated and Hammurabi is standing, and they're about at the same level here as well. The stela inscription bears 282 laws total, and it includes concepts such as innocent until proven guilty, which isn't often talked about, along with, of course, the well-known eye for an eye passage. The laws include provisions which directly address commercial, family, and civil law. This is meant as a document, as it were, in order to settle disputes, right? And of course to bring a sense of fairness and justice to the land. Here's a quote from what's inscribed on this stela: "To cause justice to prevail in the land, to destroy the wicked and the evil, that the strong might not oppress the weak." Right? That's kind of a similar sentiment. It's a very similar sentiment to our laws today. What is often not discussed in regards to the Code of Hammurabi are the writings upon it which specifically address the sentiment of justice for all and protection for the weakest citizens against wrongdoing, right? Contrary to what most people believe, the modern notion of justice for all did not originate in Western civilization. Here's a quote this is a translation from the stela. "In order that the mighty not wrong the weak, to provide just ways for the waif and the widow, I have inscribed my precious pronouncements upon my stela." It was also written that a man could come to the stela and, quote, "understand his problem, and may he be content in his heart." The code, of course, was intended to establish a sense of fairness in the land and to aid in the settlement of disputes. Now, this stela and those like it were also used for purposes which are largely ignored by many historians. At least the ones who, such as like Assyriologists and people who specialize in this specific studying cuneiform, they've found that there's a lot more than meets the eye with this code of laws that they found from ancient Persia. Another widely held belief in the West is that reading and writing was exclusive. to the priest and upper classes, as it was in Europe for a long time, right? However, reading and writing was accessible to everyone in Persia. Yes, everyone. This has been confirmed in the Oxford Handbook of Cuneiform Culture. This is something that's well known among scholars of this part of the world and of this era. In fact, it has been shown that the Stela of Hammurabi was used to teach cuneiform literacy to the general public for at least 1,000 years. Remember, the Persian Achaemenid Empire, the Zoroastrian religion, which would have been the main religion at the time, their highest virtue is knowledge and wisdom, right? So groups of students would actually, could be found at this stela learning how to use this writing system, right? Now, of course, the levels of this usage and literacy with cuneiform appear to be quite vast, just like with our language. And these levels of literacy could have ranged to, they range from simple accounting, personal letters, business documents, technical instructions, medical writings, mathematical equations, all the way up to the highest levels of artful prose and storytelling, right? There are it's just the same way it is today. There are vast different uses and different levels of literacy in our language as well, right? So if you were, say, a farmer, or you brought your crops or your livestock to market, you would need to know some simple accounting, some simple, operations. You wouldn't be writing a novel, right? So you would learn the basics. Or if you're running a small business or what have you, at that time, you would need to learn just what you needed to learn, right? Or what you wanted to learn, apparently. So, according to the Magi of the Zoroastrian religion, all things of benefit not made available to everyone was nothing less than sorcery, right? After all, this was a culture where knowledge and wisdom were the highest virtues. It was also a culture where magic and religion, really, there was no distinction, but they could certainly see that any action that is in conflict with their highest virtues would have been seen as sorcery, would have been seen as moving away from the plan of Ahura Mazda, right? Would have been in contradiction to the Mazdan way. So knowledge and wisdom is key here, right, for this culture, for this civilization. Now let's go a little bit to, we'll go towards the, we'll go into a little bit of the Judeo-Christian tradition here. Just as the 6th century Byzantine Roman Empire Justinian I condensed and modernized the extensive library of Roman law into 50 books, so were the laws of Hammurabi condensed down to just 10 commandments, right? We know quite well about the 2 stone tablets with the 10 commandments on it. The 10 commandments of the Bible were yet another attempt to modernize the law for a contemporary civilization in a way, right? Or to simplify it. Only this time, these were commandments instead of a detailed description of laws. Instead of a rule set and a rule set that an entire civilization could refer to in order, because you have to think, if knowledge and wisdom is your highest virtue in your civilization and you're taught this from an early age, there's a lot of things that you know that just don't need to be said, right? But what if you're in a culture that those aren't your highest virtues, right? Then maybe you need to be told, you need to be commanded what you should never do, right? The word commandment comes from the Latin commandare, which means to direct by authority. The word authority or author originally means father, creator, or one who brings about. So the ultimate author, of course, being none other than God. I'm not saying that Judaism is not, it very much is a religion that its highest virtue is knowledge and wisdom. It definitely is. But there's some kind of change here. There's some kind of difference with these rules. Now, the Ten Commandments aren't, obviously, they're not exactly a day-to-day legal document like you could say that the Stele of Hammurabi is. So I'm not making that direct comparison. But what we need to remember is that the concept of writing and the concept of laws in the time when they were originally produced in the ancient Persian Empire, these were considered magic, right? Because remember, there's no difference in this ancient culture. There was no difference between religion and magic, right? So any operation that came from the divine, such as the writing on the tablets and laws, there would be essentially, this is the essence of word magic, right? Because this was considered to be a magical spell. And we'll look at some of those terms that we use today in another slide or two. So ancient inscriptions or writings of all types were considered at that time the word of God in one form or another. Even the Stele of Hammurabi, right? It shows on the top, this is God giving the law to Hammurabi. It wasn't until the 16th century in Europe, around the time of the Enlightenment, that authorship of secular prose first started to appear openly. Before that time in Europe, sure, you could write for practical purposes, right? You could write for legal purposes and things. That was inherently coming down from God. But you certainly couldn't have authored, you wouldn't have penned your real name to a lot of the grimoires that came out, for example, right? Unless you wanted to be burned at the stake, right? Everything in writing for a long time in Europe, that legacy carried over from the ancients, right? That legacy carried over into Europe, and writing was considered something that was divine. And it had to, if you're writing anything of any real substance, any real importance, you're telling a story, it has to be religious. And that's how it had to be for a long time in Europe, right? So the word law originally means, and now remember, our words for law and writing especially have religious connotations because they originated in the time of myth and magic, right? So keep that in mind. So the word law means prescribed or pre-written by authority, or something laid or set. Remember, authority is the father or the creator, right? That's where this word comes from. Laws in far ancient times were set in stone. By the time of the Roman Empire, spells were cast in bronze, such as this plate of a Roman codex of laws that we see here on the left. This is where we derive such sayings as cast a spell, lay down the law, and set in stone. It comes from the far ancient originating meaning. To the ancients, inscriptions of the laws were quite literally taken as the word of God, right? And hence, such writings were attributed spiritual or magical powers. It wasn't until after the Enlightenment, Western civilization largely began to reject the idea of always being on probation from God. God's always watching you, right? That's the Catholic, that was the mainstream Christian view at the time. And it was only after the Enlightenment did the law of man begin to transcend this original notion that the law and language has only divine origin, right? That started to, we started to move away from that. However, the power of the law, the power of the written word, power of language still includes this magical operation, this recognition of this divine authority. It still includes that, and then it adds something, right? So it transcends the old and still includes it, right? It's like building a house. You can build a foundation, you build a house on top of it. You can't take the foundation away, right? So those magical operations are still there, right? It's like adding on top of, the law of man is like a recent sedimentary layer of the authority of the people administered through government. That's another layer that's built on top of the original layer of the divine, having to do with law. The deeper we look into the meanings and origins of words relating to law and writing in particular, the stronger the links between magic and religion become. So as to reach a point in our understanding that there is really no distinction between the two, just like the original understanding of the Persian Magi, just like how they saw the world, right? Religions that thrive on conquest make no allowances for magic or operative theology. Remember, operative theology is you are initiated into a mystic tradition or religion. You reach a certain point, and then you have this almost like a rite of passage. In fact, it can very much be. You have a rite of passage, and you come into your own spirituality. And the operative theology is essentially you've reached a stage where you realize your own divinity, and you're going to understand that and realize that in your own way. There's no way to do that. There's no way for a priest on Sunday standing in front of the congregation to tell you how that is going to be for you or you or you or you or anyone, right? It's personal. That's an operative theology. And the Christian church, of course, leveraged this. They would leverage this operative theology or this magic that one would practice in their own lives. A wise mystic from the East, for example, they would leverage that magic to increase their conquest because they would see that magic as both a threat and to their own system, but also going against God's laws. Because remember, in the traditional Christian sense, at least when it comes to God, we're not talking about Jesus at all, but when we're talking about God, the view is that he is jealous and he doesn't want you to seek out knowledge, right? So religions that thrive on nurturing the human divinity, promoting your ascendance to the divine, trying to help you, help you. That's a concept, right? Trying to help you reach your own divine nature. They cannot distinguish their religion from magic at all. Yet they still fully account for the differences between magic and sorcery. It's not as if evil goes away, right? That's not the case at all. There are a lot of different religions in India, for example, that venerate each other's deities. It's not a big deal, right? There's a lot of new religions out there that are fairly young from India, and it's built upon older traditions, but they don't look at all of the other sects of Hinduism, for example, and say, "Oh, these are all crap," right? That's just not how their minds work there. That's not how they see this thing, because the cosmos is so vast, and you have this basically endless possibilities in the universe. How could divinity and God be understood in just one way, right? Under one doctrine. That's just laughable, right? If you're if you're a religious person in Asia. So let's briefly compare some of the world's most popular religions side by side. I want to start with Christianity. It has the most followers in the world at just around over 2 billion. It has been used as a religion of conquest by many civilizations throughout history. So I would make the argument that opportunistic civilizations have this ready-made, built-in license to conquer, right? Like the Spanish Empire, for example. Christianity has been used as a religion of conquest, I wouldn't say since the beginning. And I would say that the teachings of Jesus are, I consider those separate, actually, because they totally contradict a lot of the things from the Old Testament, for example. I'm not an expert in the Bible, but that's just my perspective. Christianity, of course, is actively spread throughout the world by its missionaries. So this is, if you have a religion that's actively seeking more people to join their desperate company of oddfellows, as Alan Watts famously said, right? Then there's got to be some insecurity there, right? Someone wants you to join in what they're doing. It makes them feel better. It lends some legitimacy to what they're doing, superficially, but not really, right? Because if you really feel connected to the divine, then you're not going around. You might want to help people in different ways, of course. You want to shine your light into the world, but you're not saying this is how you should do it, because you know that doesn't work, right? So the world's second biggest religion, of course, is Islam. Like Christianity, it has been used as a religion of conquest almost since its inception. It is actively spread throughout the world by its most dedicated followers, right? It should be no surprise at all, then, that the top two religions in the world have spread by conquest, right? Now, having said that, there are mystic traditions under the umbrella of Christianity. There are mystic traditions under the umbrella of Islam, such as the Sufis, which is a beautiful religious tradition. And so I consider the Sufis, they are Muslims, and they are open, and they are mature in their faith, and they're not running around trying to convert the rest of the world, right? And fight about whose God is right and all of this stuff. The world's third largest religion is Hinduism. And Hinduism is kind of a very broad, that's a very broad religion, because a lot of different religions have come from Hinduism. Unlike the previous two, and all of the religions which rank after Hinduism, there is no central authority or doctrine, really. There's no central church of Hinduism, right? They give you this, you have this sort of, these Puranas, these stories, these cultural teachings, and you have this rough framework, but you're not really, you're taught some valuable wisdom, like in all religions. There's good wisdom to be had, but you can go completely your own way, right? Like I said, there are no missionaries of Hinduism, and varying sects of the Hindus commonly venerate each other's deities. They're not fighting over, hey, this is these people that are into Shiva over here, and Hanuman, and all these different deities. We're not down with that. Like, it's not really a big deal. They're just different expressions of the divine, right? Makes sense. The fourth largest religion is Buddhism. It has long been debated in the West if Buddhism is even a religion at all, right? And I would say that foolishly the lens of Western religion is placed over top of Buddhism. And so these, when you try to understand Buddhism through the lens of a Westerner, then it's not going to work, right? It's like if all you speak is Greek and you're trying to learn Russian, you have to not bring your Greek to the Russian, right? Don't bring your Christianity to Buddhism. Buddhism is essentially an export of Hinduism, right? And it really caught on and blended with the philosophy of China, of of course, Lao Tzu in China, and Taoism. And it's spread through Southeast Asia, Thailand, Cambodia, Japan has its own Zen Buddhism, right? And it's, of course, spread to the West. The fifth largest religion in the world is Sikhism. This was founded in the 15th century in India by Guru Nanak. It contends that no religion in the world has a monopoly on absolute truth, right? It has no quarrels with other faiths, and it doesn't position itself as the sole authority, right? I recently attended the 200th anniversary of the birth of the Bab. The Bab is the prophet from the Baha'i faith of India, and this is only like 200 years old. There are so many different sects of Hinduism, and it's just mind-boggling how many different religions there are that have sprung out of these ancient traditions of India, for example, right? So you can see this slide is we can see the contrast here between the religions of conquest in the West and the religions of nurturing, you could say, or the religions of peace. The religions of peace come from far older traditions. Of course, Christianity it borrows from traditions from Judaism and from ancient Persia. So does Islam. But you could almost say that they are not, Islam especially is not, it's only 1,400 years old, almost 1,500 years old. It hasn't had the time to mature, in a sense, right? You could think of it that way. It's much younger than Hinduism, for example. So maybe it needs time to mature and settle down, right? So I don't think it's any coincidence that Christianity and Islam are the youngest religions, and they're the ones that are like, hey, and they've got all this energy and they're trying to change the world and spreading everything, right? So. Hi, this is the end of this part of the video. Stay tuned for the continuation next week. If you enjoy what I'm doing, please subscribe, hit the like button, and feel free to add your comments as well. Thanks so much for watching. See you next week.